Hey, welcome everyone to Unraveling the Darkness. Tonight we are going to have Rich Daniels on. Rich is a Bigfoot researcher and has also had a Bigfoot experience. So I am excited to talk to him about that. I appreciate everyone staying with us. I had a couple 2-week hiatus, went on vacation. Gina and I and a couple of friends went to Alaska on a cruise. And of course, service isn't so great on a cruise ship. So thanks for hanging out with us and following us and watching. I'm going to bring Rich in and we are going to start the show. Hey, Rich, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for coming on. Before the show, we were having some audio and video issues, but it seems like we should be fine now and everything should be great.
Working great here.
Yes. So you are a Bigfoot researcher and had a Bigfoot experience. What made you want to do research on Bigfoot?
Well, actually, I've had four experiences,
Oh,
encounters over 20 years, or over 20 years of research. And the first time was in January of 2000. And I can tell you that at that point in my life, I knew nothing about this subject. I didn't think about it, didn't worry about it. It was tabloid supermarket headlines, and that was it to me. I didn't think too much about it. And then one of these things showed up in front of me, and I was of the mind at that point I didn't even know what I was looking at when it came down to it. And I think a lot of people that get into the research and pursue it seriously would probably tell you the same thing that I'm going to tell you, which is this gets in your blood. Once you have that experience, once your reality shifts because of what you're going through and what you experience, it doesn't go away, and you have to pursue it. And I can tell you, one of the things that I tell people over and over again is that all I want to know is what's going on. I just want to know the truth, and I don't care about anything else. And staying with this as doggedly as I have over 20 years should demonstrate that, because it's just about finding out what's going on. And unfortunately, it's one of those
we
uh,
are.
one of those subjects where that question or that answer generates about five more questions to take in. And it's not just the research, it's the realm in which the research takes place that you start to notice things about. And it makes it a very, very different experience.
So let's go to that first experience. What were you doing when you had that?
Actually, I was the young lady that I was dating at the time had two kids, and we found ourselves in on a Sunday with it was a very warm day for that time period. I was living and working in Western Maryland, and we were getting there in January we were getting a day that was up around 60 degrees, which you don't get very often in that region. The foothills of the Appalachians. So when you get a warm day, you take advantage of it. We took kids out for a picnic. Then we went and visited friends, which turned into dinner out, and it turned into a kind of a late evening to get back. We were getting in somewhere 9 o'clock or so, and her house was back off a road and was right at the edge of a forested area. And the moment we got out of the car, we could hear something big moving in the woods. And when you hear something like that in that region, you think black bear, and that's what we just assumed what we had. And the woods were situated maybe 40 feet or so from where the car was. And so we just, she hustled her two kids in there to get them up to bed. Unfortunately, it was my job to clear out the car of all the leftover food and dishes and everything from the picnic. And I didn't want to make two trips with a black bear milling around. So I filled up my arms, and I was just, I had to use my elbow to put the hatchback of the car down, and did that and ran inside, everything good. After a couple of minutes, she comes back down, from upstairs, and looks out the door to see if she can see the bear. And what she did see was that I have a very inefficient elbow because the dome light in her car was still on. And, she had to go to work the next day. It's going to run the car battery down. Long story short, chivalry's not dead. I said, okay, I'll go out there and take care of it. And the first thing I did was basically she had a little mud room there, right at the back door, and turned the light out there, turned the outside light out, and trying to get my eyes to readjust because a black bear at night, tough to see. I wanted to have, as much of an advantage as I could to see. And when I was doing that, I realized there was more light out there than I had given credit to. I don't know whether it was a full moon or near a full moon at that time, but there was a lot of moonlight and much more than I had realized. And then off to my left, 150 feet or so was a lamppost. And that lamppost was at the fork of the driveways. The right fork went to my girlfriend's house, and the left fork went further up the drive up to where her uncle lived, about 500 feet away or so. So I was getting some ambient light from that. And when I felt comfortable enough, I stepped outside, and my eye was on a particular point on the tree line because the entire tree line was lined with bushes and briars. And, my time in the woods, I knew bears didn't want to go through that stuff. They would take the path of least resistance the same way we would. Right. So they don't want to get hurt any more than anyone else does. So there was a point on the tree line that had been trampled down, and it was open, and we walked through there a lot. It was about 15 feet wide in the tree line. That coincided with the canopy of the trees, which hung down to a level of about 5 feet. So it was about 15 by 5 space. And in my mind, I was thinking, if he's coming at me, he's coming at me out of there. So if I watch that, I'll be okay. And I walked up to the back of the car with my eyes on that point the entire time, that space. And as I put my hand on the hatchback of the car and pushed down, I saw movement in that space. And this is the first really weird thing about it all, because the movement wasn't across the space and it wasn't coming out of the space. The movement that I saw was straight down. It was like a mass going straight down. And I froze and I stared right where the movement was, and I started to see this silhouette, this outline. And it was like a brown silhouette against a black surface, a black background. Mm-hmm. To be honest with you, if there hadn't been any movement there, I doubt I'd have even seen it. But I focused in on it, and the more I looked at it, the more detail I could make out. And the first thing I saw was the fact that there were these shoulders, and they went straight out. And they had to be 3 feet wide. I mean, just these massive shoulders. And I'm looking at this thing going like, what kind of bear is that? Bears don't have shoulders like that. Bears are slope shouldered, every last one of them. Right. And, I'm looking at this thing, and it's like, okay, this thing just sat down and its shoulders are like that. So what is that? In my mind, I'm going like, what kind of bear is this? And then the next thing I noticed were, it was like knees sticking up, kind of like odd angles, like this. And I'm staring at this thing going like, is that thing crouching? It looked like it was crouching like a baseball catcher, Okay. And I think bears just don't sit like that.
Right.
Bears, they sit down on their haunches the way a dog does, or they just sit right on their behind and their feet stick out. And I'm thinking like, how does this thing crouch? So what kind of bear is this? And what I didn't understand at the time, and I later came to learn, was that I was going through an experience called cognitive dissonance. It's where the input that you're getting, your brain is just not processing. It's just not wrapping around it at all. And there's a huge misunderstanding of what's going on in your mind. And that's what I was going through, because in my mind, I'm looking at a bear, and yet this thing doesn't look like any bear that I've ever seen. And the next thing I really noticed was just how big this thing was. It had, in my mind, it had sat down, and yet its head was up right next to the canopy of the trees, 5 feet up. So in a sitting position or a crouching position like it was 5 feet up.
Wow.
And I'm thinking, that thing is huge. And that's when it kind of struck me that this thing's about 40 feet away from me. And I had 25 feet to cover to get back into the house. And anyone who's been in the woods any amount of time knows you don't run from a bear, because a bear will trigger their predator response and they'll chase you down and they will hurt you, whether they're hungry or not. So,
Well, and 40 feet for him would be, maybe 4 or 5 strides.
yeah. Well, at that point, at that point, I think I'm looking at a bear.
Right.
So, so I'm looking at this and I'm just staring at this thing and I'm staring at this thing. And it went for like over a minute. And then from the side, I hear my girlfriend at the door going, "What are you trying to do? Get killed?" And then it just total snap back to reality. Like, okay, what am I going to do here? And at that point, I just started to back up, just walk backwards, back towards the house with my eyes on this thing. And I made it about 10 feet and it hadn't moved. So I just sort of, turned around and walked back into the house. No problems, nothing. We stayed up for a while. I told her, I said, that was the biggest, weirdest bear I've ever seen. And so we wanted to make sure nothing happened around. So we were up for a while. Nothing did. Okay. So now you fast forward 5 years. Okay. I'm no longer in Western Maryland. I'm in Orlando, Florida, where I live now. I'm no longer with that lady. I had met the lady who became my wife, and we had moved down to Orlando. One of the things I deal with on a regular basis is insomnia. It's inevitable. I have nights where I just don't sleep much or anything like that. And on one of those nights, I'm sitting there in my living room, flipping through the channels. And, 3 o'clock in the morning, boom, there's this show on Bigfoot. And I distinctly remember saying the words, "This will put me to sleep." Yeah. And so I settle in, I start watching it. And about 15 minutes into the show, there's a guy from Washington State who comes on there and is talking about the experience he had. And what he had dealt with was he heard a ruckus out on the deck of his house. And he ran out to see it and turned around and looked. And at the corner where the railing of the deck and the deck met the house, there was something crouching there. And he proceeded to describe it. And what he described was about 95% match to what I instantly remembered seeing 5 years prior. And the thought of that hit me, and I immediately broke out into a cold sweat. My hands began to shake just looking at this. And, I got up and went to go splash water on my face in the bathroom. I had lost all the color in my face. Everything I had just gone pale. And that realization of what I had seen 5 years later, 1,000 miles away, hit me like a jackhammer. And, again, at the moment, I didn't know what I was going through, but I was going through what's called a stress response. And a stress response is how your body reacts to acute stress or trauma that you're experiencing at that time. And I was getting it 5 years in the past, 5 years in the future,
Right.
from it. And I proceeded to just go into this state where I couldn't think straight. I mean, the stress response is something that triggers and re-triggers, and it comes from a buildup or a release of cortisol. It's basically cortisol in your head, in your brain, is like adrenaline for your body. It fires your brain up, prepares you for any threat that could be there. It's in response to a perceived threatening situation. And every time I kept thinking about that situation, every time I kept thinking about that thing being 40 feet away from me, and the thought that it could have easily walked over there and pulled my arms out of my sockets and done whatever it wanted to, it just threw me back into this, and I went into this state. And what happens when you go into this stress response state? You go into a physical and mental condition that's kind of like having ADHD. You are hyper aware of minute details. You're hyped up all the time, and you become very irritable. It's very hard to deal with. And I went through this over and over and over again for about 3 days.
Wow.
Just stumbling through this thing re-triggering again and again and again in my head. And after that time, my wife, my first wife at the time, she stopped me and said, "What's wrong?" Because usually I'm usually a very laid back guy, very talkative, very personable. Um, I happen to think I'm funny. I don't know about a lot of people,
I do
but
too.
that kind of that kind of stuff. But and it's at that point that I said to her what I've come to call the words. And the words are what any Bigfoot witness ever says to the first person they're going to tell about their experience. And the words are, "I just don't think you're going to believe me." And luckily, she said, "Tell me what's going on." And I related the story to her. And, to her credit, she never ever told me whether she believed in Bigfoot or not or anything like that. And she actually ended up when we moved here to New Mexico, and she worked for the U.S. Forest Service for 12 years. And she never said a word to me about it, anything like that. But what she understood was the incredible impact that experience had on me. It was something that had changed me in a lot of ways. And that's the support that I think a lot of people that go through these experiences don't get. They face a lot of ridicule, harassment, and worse. And I did a case study with a lot of people later on, and they related some of those kind of experiences that they went through. And ever since then, I've been searching desperately to find out just what happened to me, just what's going on out there. And all I really want to have is the truth.
Right. I think we do that. I'm more on the paranormal side with the ghosts. I think that's the same thing. We just want to
Absolutely.
know what's going on and what's out there and and why are you still here, right? So,
Yep.
and that's kind of the Bigfoot thing. Like, why do we rarely see them? Why do we have this response? You know,
Well,
so
I did a case study where I interviewed over like 408 people about their experiences, and I went through a specific process to be able to work with them on being able to really just document all the after effects and all the everything that they had gone through, right down from the moments of after their encounter straight through the present day that I was talking to. And what that worked out to be is that I found 148 of those cases that were absolute, as good as you're going to get when it comes to a Bigfoot sighting. Yes, I absolutely saw big hairy hominid, two bipedal walking through, and the rest of them, there was some reason not to use them because they're either they weren't it turned out they really weren't sure what they were seeing, or some people just refused the process altogether and everything. So you take those cases and you set them aside. It's not that you don't believe them, it's just that you want a consistent database to be able to work from as far as the data that you're going to provide. And so it turned out to be about a third of the stories that I selected for data, and was able to go through it. And what it comes down to is that people who went through that experience mirrored the same type of reactions, the stress reactions that they're called, that you get from other forms of trauma that are far more common, like severe car accidents, people that witness acts of violence, severe negligence, and or things like that. The same type of reactions, the same type of after effects that you get from established, and accepted forms of trauma. Now, my studies have further gone to, it parallels perfectly with people that have gone through the UFO UAP experience
mhm.
and the paranormal experience. People have who have encountered ghosts and spirits and demons and and things like that. And it all just kind of correlates. Basically, it is a measure of how we as human beings react to and handle and process stress. And that whole spectrum, that whole stress response spectrum, starts at a very low level and very simple things that that seem very minor. And on the other end of it is PTSD, where people have actual psychological damage, and it makes it hard for them, to continue in a lot of these things. And that, to me, lends credence to all of these things, because when you've got somebody who has been through, just say, a severe car accident where there were fatalities, and they lived through that, and they have the PTSD after that, and you've got somebody else who is severely traumatized enough to change major things in their lives because of an experience that they had in the woods like this, and they're reacting the same way to these things. That, to me, gives you a firm foot in established science.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting how even just that seeing a figure that you don't know exactly what it is gives you that same connection to a severe trauma incident, right? Um, do you continue to have those from that or from any of the other sightings?
Well, I think, talking about it and researching it so much, I mean, everybody develops coping mechanisms, and I have
Mhm.
mine. It's not that I don't feel that, that charge that you get, because, the thing I point out to people is, the difference between nervous and excited. Physically, they feel the same. Psychologically, they feel the same. It's just your point of view on what you're dealing with. So I still, when I go back over those things in my mind, I still feel those things. I still understand those things. But I've done it so much at this point that I'm to the point now where it doesn't really hit me that hard, but it's still significant in my mind.
So let's
And
take that nervous to excited. You take your first experience and you take that trauma, and now you spin it to where now you get the excitement from it to
mhm,
go do more research and
yeah, you
possibly
still
get
get that.
another
You
sighting,
still
right?
get, yeah, you still get that charge. You still get that juice to go from it. And and every conversation that I have about this subject with people, it just, I'm ready for another 10,000 miles, and just ready to go for it. And but that's the way it comes. That's how life changing this stuff can be. And fortunately for me, it's been able to be channeled in a very positive direction, to the point where I've been able to help some people cope with their experiences. And I still keep in touch with a number of people that participated in that study. And boy, there's some stories that come out of that. I'm telling you, I thought mine was pretty significant, but I ran across a guy who was so traumatized by his experience. Maybe it was from his description, it was about a 20-second encounter to where he had eyes on one of these things. And it changed everything in his life. He was out hunting, and turned around. He was sitting in a tree stand and heard noise behind him. Turned around and looked and saw one of these things from the chest up, from behind a rise of bushes. And he described the expression on its face in such detail. And that's one of the things that to look for when you have when you're dealing with somebody who's had an encounter, and it could be any paranormal encounter, because these experiences translate. And it's that detail, and that's the amygdala in your brain marrying memory to trauma, memory to acute stress. And your brain does that so you can recognize that situation again, and better be able to avoid it, and stay away. That's the natural progression of it all. And this guy ended up, he was on the property of a friend of his, and he ended up never returning to that property ever again. That particular property was on his way, the way he drove to work. He detoured around that property, which added another 20 to 25 minutes every day, making it
Wow.
a huge, taking a 20 to 25-minute commute and turning it into a 40 to 45-minute commute every day, back both there and home. And he did that for over 20 years. And
Wow.
I ran across him in a Facebook group, and he had watched me interact with some people, because I was trying to find people to have in the study, and
Mhm.
he direct messaged me, And he said, I might as well tell you because you don't know me, you can't do anything to me, you can't hurt me. And it seems like you want to help people. And I was the first person he had told about his experience in 36 years.
Wow.
And he had gone to the point where he sold his hunting rifle. He got rid of all the clothes that he was wearing that day because every time he saw one of those items or touched one of those items, he was triggered again. And he went into that stress response, the same stress response that I described earlier. And if you can imagine that, trying to live your life that way, I mean, it cost him a marriage. It was a major drag on his life, and it caused him a lot of trouble. And that's one person out at the extreme end of it. And there are plenty of people that were lesser experiences and lesser reactions to it. But it's not uncommon to meet somebody like that if you get deep enough into the Bigfoot world.
Sure. So you had mentioned your first experience was in Maryland, and you had 4 total. Where were your other 3?
The second one I had was in Colorado. It was on the western side of the Rockies in Colorado, about 50 or 60 miles outside of a town called Silverton.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the result of me hooking up with a couple of researchers in that area. That was after I had moved here to New Mexico, and I had run across these guys, again, connecting on social media and talking to them, and they invited me up. And my third trip out with them, we had a fun experience. My third encounter was here in New Mexico, one that I produced myself. I had tracked down an area of activity, and it was probably one of the stupidest things I've ever done in my life, which was go out into the woods by myself and not even realize that I was unarmed pretty much. All I had was a folding knife, and a can of bear spray. And I was going out into an area. It was a state park here in New Mexico that closes. Of course, you have the Park Service. They close it at dusk, and I snuck in about 40 minutes before dusk and set myself up at this area. I thought I had found an area where they were transiting in and out of the park to go to the outskirts of a local town to forage. And what had drawn me to actually start looking at that area was an article in the paper here in New Mexico about this particular town was experiencing a sudden spike in missing dogs and cats.
No.
And I thought about that, and I'd heard a lot of speculation about, the Bigfoot predation on domesticated animals and stuff. And I spent a couple of years actually checking out this area, and going into this one, I went out there and I kept telling myself, okay, I've got this figured out. I've solved this. I'm going to be the man. I'm going to be that guy that solves this whole thing. And went in there, and there was a little, I don't even know what to call this thing. It was a depression in the ground that, it was maybe a couple of hundred to 300 feet long, about 30 feet deep or so, and about 50 feet wide. And it straddled the border of this park. And my idea was that they were getting down in this thing and slipping out of the park without being seen. So I set up on the edge of this thing and built a blind. I built up a blind that was about 4 feet high out of the deadfall that was around, and just basically sat there and was going to be a listening post all night. And somewhere around, I guess, I'd been there for about 5 hours, and then in the distance I heard a call, and one of those long moaning calls that you hear, and it seemed like it was fairly far away. And then a few minutes later, I heard another one, and it seemed closer. And then later on, I heard a third one, and it was definitely closer, and it was definitely coming my direction. And then a few minutes later, the fourth one played out, and I said, that's a mile away from me or so. And it still continued to come my direction. And then about a half hour later, I started to hear noises in the forest, and those noises became footfalls, and it was bipedal footfalls. and boom, 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 and it was going just pretty regularly. And then all of a sudden they stopped. It was about my 1 o'clock position where they stopped. And that's when I started to hear growls and barks and little chirps and everything like that. And then they became more and more, they became greater length and greater intensity. And when I say greater intensity, I can tell you that because I could feel sound waves hitting me in the face and my chest. I was sitting on a 5-gallon bucket that it had a cover on it that had basically a basic seat pad on it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was exposed above the blind about this much, and I could feel the sound waves hitting me. And
How far away do you think they were at that point?
I'm guessing, I mean, because it was pitch black, so I'm guessing somewhere in the area, maybe 25 yards,
Wow.
75 feet or so.
Okay.
And I'm hearing these sounds, and all of a sudden this thing starts to move to one side, and it's going this way. And at that point, when the sound waves started hitting me in the face, I kind of realized that I was so far in over my head at that point that, and it flashed through my head. What am I going to do? Am I going to tickle this thing with a folding knife? Or, hopefully, it doesn't drink bear spray for breakfast, that kind of thing. And so
here's my thought real quick, and it's on bears. And I think that it may roll over to Bigfoot. I don't know. If bears knew how good ear scratches felt,
I love it.
Yeah, they wouldn't be as mean.
I don't want to be the first guy to try it, but I would love it. But yeah,
could be the same for Bigfoot.
Yeah. Well, this thing started to move, and the only thing that I could do at that point, I was just so fired up and so I didn't know what to do. The only thing I think was, don't let an angry animal behind you.
Right.
So I just kind of pivoted on that bucket, and I stayed facing wherever the noise was coming from. And this thing started moving around, and it was stomping, and it was it was just like smacking stuff and everything. Anything it could do to try and scare me away. And I felt that way. And this thing moved in about a 270-degree arc around my position, trying to spook me. And this went on for about 40 minutes or so. And then at that point, I could hear this thing, a tree branch snap off, and it was just like a pop. And I knew exactly what it was, and I said, that thing just ripped a branch off a tree. He said, come over here and beat the daylights out of me with it. And I just sat there, I locked, tried to face where it was coming from. And then a few seconds later, I heard this thing just hits the ground right next to me, just a few feet away from me. And, of course, startled and everything. And I got a few more barks and then I could hear it move away. It was headed back in the direction that it came from. And it less and less and less over that time. And at this point, it's maybe 4 o'clock in the morning. And I'm sitting there and I'm saying to myself, there's no way I could outrun this thing. And I certainly can't outrun it if he's going to get his buddies. So, I don't want to use my flashlight because I'll lose whatever night vision I have. I won't be able to detect anything. And so I just, okay, I got to sit here. I got to sit here and wait till I can see. And the last thing I wanted to do is go slamming into a tree in the dark. So I just sat there, and the noise disappeared. It dissipated, fairly quickly. And I just sat there in the dark, and probably one of the most ominous times of my life, just wondering what was going to happen next. And then finally, the first light of the day started to come in, and as soon as I could see proficiently enough, I started packing up my stuff. And as I'm doing this, I looked over at this tree branch that he had thrown, and it was about this big around.
Wow.
Maybe about 5-6 inches thick.
Mm-hmm.
And it was about 7 or 8 feet long. And so I'm guessing it was about 60 or 70 pounds worth of a branch that he had just snapped off a tree, number one. It was easy to see, it just ripped off and thrown, an estimated 75 feet with some accuracy. Yeah, and that was it at that point for me. I was ready to lose it, and I picked up all my stuff and I took a 45-minute hike and turned it into about a 20-minute jog, getting out of there. Made it to my car, got everything loaded up, and got in my car. I had the car keys in my hand, and it was at that point that I am not too proud to admit that I just broke down. I broke down, crying. All that emotion that I had been able to keep focused on and keep bottled up just came out all at that one time. And that, again, stupidest thing I've ever done in my life, because I not only was I not prepared for what probably wasn't going to be there, I wasn't prepared for what was there. That was an area where people have been attacked by bears. It was an area, that was not patrolled. It was remote. And I was out there virtually unprotected. I feel so lucky to be sitting here right now, because of all that.
So let's take those two experiences that you've talked about, plus all the interviews that you've done with people. The attacks on a person, you've interviewed all these people. Was there ever an attack on a person?
I never interviewed anybody that had any physical contact, had ever been, struck or grabbed or anything like that. There are stories out there like that.
Right.
I've interviewed a number of people that have experienced faux charges. In other words, the creature just barrels through the woods towards you and then stops short, kind of like what an elephant does.
Right.
When they do those charges like that. There's been people who've gone through that. There's been people who have been struck by objects that were thrown. I had one guy who he was very, very descriptive of the 5 pine cones that he had gotten hit with while he was sitting at his campfire. And you don't think about that, but he said, the first 3 I didn't really think about it too much. He said, then I got hit again, and I started looking around, and I realized I wasn't under a tree. So something was launching these things at him. And he said, well, a bear can't do that. A mountain lion can't do that. Got to be something with a hand, and he's thinking, of course he's thinking there's another person out there. And then he had proceeded to, to hear some noises and things like that he had never heard before. And it was, a harrowing thing for him. But no, never anybody that had any actual physical contact with one of the beings.
Yeah. So we take the like tree thumping, and we take the rock throwing, and we take your branch, and we put all this together, right? And now it's like, okay, are they scared of us? Are they, because we're sitting there and we're like, oh gosh, what's going on? Are they doing the same thing? Like, what's over here and it shouldn't be here, and I need to get it away?
Well, again, and you take a look at the behaviors that we know, what we've experienced from them. They're very aloof. They're very secretive. And when you get too close to something that apparently is important to them, they will react and they will try to get you out of there.
Right.
And there's 3 things that they absolutely need to survive, which is food, water, and security. And if you're an imminent threat to any of that, they will react, and as they would with anything that would be a threat. But when it comes down to it,
right?
Yeah,
I mean,
same thing we do.
Food, water, and our shelter. If you're trying to break into our house, we're going to react, right? Yeah. So now we're out. I say we. I'm not going out to research Bigfoot, and I'm not going out to try to find one. That was Jason's thing, and I'm like, yeah, I'll go sit in the car and wait with you. But I'm not
smart man
going out to the woods, but I'll be here when you get back. So we take this and we are going into their space, just like someone would be coming into ours. They just want us gone, and we try to scare someone off before we want to attack them. And I think that's what all this other stuff is too. And
there's a lot of things that point in a particular direction when it comes down to what we do know about these things, and most of what, people want to talk about is physical evidence. And what, being my background, I have worked 12 years in the mental behavioral health field. And I point to behavioral evidence, just like you brought up, just like how they react when something important to them is threatened. And there's a lot of behavioral evidence out there that will tell you a lot about what they're doing and why they're doing it. And you can reverse engineer those behaviors a little bit to get inside the motivations of what's going on with it. And I think it's important to understand that. And the best researchers out there understand the behaviors that they're experiencing, not just what's happening, but the behaviors can tell you why. And when you start to look at the why, you start to see a lot of similarities between us and them, and you would understand why we would be the greatest threat to their existence. And conversely, what happens though, yes, we're the most significant threat that they face, but we're also a very advantageous group to be around. And if you think about it, if you live in close enough proximity to a dwelling of human beings, we throw away a lot of food. We have dwellings, or we have buildings that we just don't use. Old barns and old abandoned houses and things like that. And they've been spotted using those kind of things for cover and shelter. And you don't know how many people I've talked to that had encounters with these things in orchards or cornfields. Of course you would. They need the food, and they're going to stay close to these food sources. So there's a lot of evidence that points. A lot of behavioral evidence that points me towards, looking at what you're trying to figure out what we're dealing with, and if you get deep enough into it, you start thinking you're not dealing with a what, you're dealing with a who.
Well, someone that's adaptive, right?
Exactly.
Because they're, like you said, they're coming into these structures and they're coming in they know where the food is, or when something new is getting planted, they turn over these fields every few years and maybe they plant something else so it's not as hard on the ground. Mm-hmm. So do they get into this pattern? And, we see the patterns, like Expedition Bigfoot. I'll take that because I started watching that. And you see this pattern along the Northwest where they're back and forth, right? And it's their area. But what changes for them to come back and forth? Well, you get the salmon spawn up north. So now they're going to go where the food is, and then they're going to come back. So if we take, and let's go back 100 years before the West was really settled, or 150 years, and you take these nomadic tribes that were moving with food and shelter, that's really what we're dealing with, right? That same type nomadic person or thought, nomadic thought.
Yeah. But as it's good that you said that, because some of the best people to speak to about this phenomenon are the Native American, tribes and pueblos that we've got out here. I've been out on the Navajo Nation here. It straddles the New Mexico Arizona border, and I've been invited out there. It's such a privilege to have somebody invite you out there and to be able to see it. But when you go there, it's a totally different way to deal with the situation. They treat encounters with Bigfoot like nuisance animal calls, and they call the police, and the police come out and investigate it and everything like that. And it's just a matter of fact thing that they are out there, and they'll tell you that they're out there, and it's incredible. The difference is when driving. When I drive 3.5 hours out there, and then I drive the 3.5 hours back to Albuquerque, the total different perspective on that. And you talk about, these are the oldest inhabitants that we know of our country, and they're the land that we have, and they have a long history of dealing with these creatures. So it's an amazing dichotomy that you have. between the two worlds. And there's, no matter what you do, there's going to be people that aren't going to believe a word you say. But then you talk to folks like these who say, "Oh yeah, I can go show you footprints right now," and they can do that. And you can if you know somebody, you can see police reports about these incidents and things like that. So
Wow.
it's incredible how it works. And I've gotten to the point where I won't even talk to people that want to debate existence of these things. It's just, it's time and energy. I mean, I'm 60 years old. Time and energy I don't have. So I just want to be able to move on and do what I do. And it's
Right.
not that I can't stand those people. It's just that I'm at a different place than they are. And I'm moving on to a different area of this thing. And I can talk about it in such detail and such depth that would just make their eyes spin sometimes.
Well, and in the paranormal field, like your Bigfoot research field, there's always skeptics, right? And I
Yeah.
love the skeptics. We host a ghost story night. You come tell your ghost stories, and I love the ones like, I don't believe, but I had this one experience.
Hmm. Yep.
So,
Well, I actually belong to a lot of skeptic groups on social media, and I do so because they ask the best questions. The skeptics are the ones that are going to keep you on your toes and keep you moving forward in the right direction. Because the moment you get off track on something, there's somebody out there that is going to say, "Hey, what about this?" And it's incredible to me that they do that. And I mean, I'll tell people all the time is, look, I wish you could stand in my shoes for a while. I really do, because with your inquisitive nature and your demand for doing the best work possible, it makes it, it would make a great combination. So, I love, skeptics don't bother me. It's the ones that, the ones that graduate from being a skeptic to being a troll. Those are
mhm,
the ones that I have an issue with.
yeah. You know, I I feel there's something out there and I don't know what it is. I'm not going to spend the time in the woods to find out what it is. Um, we were able to investigate a house in Nebraska, and Bigfoot Kinney from Estes Park, it was his house, and he had castings there. And when you can see the arch and the ridges in the feet and everything like that in these castings, I don't know how you can say that, it's not human like,
Hmm.
or at least like a human type foot, and can't
And a
say,
lot of those castings have been authenticated by scientists, by real scientists, by usually by anthropologists who are taking a look at this thing. And and I know some people are doing some amazing work out there. A gentleman by the name of Dave Zagan. He is a professional forensic investigator for law enforcement, and his demands are of such, you got to have such good science going into it. And the conversations I've had with him, he said he's never seen one that he would authenticate himself, but he keeps looking. And he's really, he's sold on the fact that there's a lot of experiences going on, but he's the one that's looking for the hard and fast thing that he can see and have in his hands. And he told me, the moment I have it, everybody's going to know. So it's incredible that they have it. There's a lot of people out there with scientific background, with scientific practice, that are working on this thing. And what I've learned from them is we got to ask better questions, and
mhm.
we got to ask better questions of ourselves.
Well,
And
I think it's those people that really help some people who don't realize or think that there's something out there. When you actually have someone with that scientific background that's been out doing research on stuff and other things and finding other primates, for the first time or something like that, it really opens their eyes to think that, it's possible that there is something out there that we don't know what it is yet.
the experiences are too numerous and too consistent for there not to be. I
Yeah.
thought when I had my first experience, I was alone in the world. I thought I was isolated. And because we're talking back in 2000, so there wasn't a tremendous amount or 2005 when I had realized what was going on. So the internet wasn't a tremendously hot thing at that point. But once I gained an online presence and was online every day, like a lot of folks are, I started to realize there's people out there. There's other people out there, and I started to relate to that. And it was about 2016 that I started to recognize the fact that, okay, there's something going on here with this emotional disturbance, with this trauma, with these stress reactions. And I got into an area of the research that a lot of people don't come anywhere close to. So it's been interesting, to say the least. But the one thing I'll tell you is that the dots that connect, that line up to connect, are telling us that we're not dealing. I mean, everybody wants to say we're dealing with an ape, and there's no ape. All the footprint casts that you've seen, all the footprints that people have found, have given you something that is adapted for upright walking. Period. Okay, you can't just have the foot adapted though, because
Right.
to accommodate upright walking, you have to have additional adaptations to the ankle and the knee, the hip, the lower back, and even the neck to be able to do that. Now, we know of 21 instances in the fossil record where this has happened. These are the 21 identified, confirmed species that are within the human family of evolution. And so you tell me, you just that bit of knowledge alone tells me what we're dealing with. And I think we're dealing with a relict hominid species of, I think we're looking at number 22. I think we're looking at another species of human. And that information, if that information ever became confirmed, I think you'd have bedlam in our society.
Wow. So what's in the future? When's your next going out to the woods and waiting?
Honestly, I haven't been out in the woods since 2019. And the reason for that is, some health issues that I've had. My career in athletics left me with 8 knee operations, and I've had both my hips replaced. So I think my extensive woods stomping era is over. But I still go on occasion. I still go out, but I'm somebody who believes that going out to do that. That's the same thing that's been going on for 60 years since the search was popularized. And what has it netted us? What has it gotten us? And you go out there looking for these things. Guess what? You're in their backyard. You're in their habitat. They know everything about it, and you know virtually nothing. I don't care how much you think you know those woods. They know them better than you do. And it hasn't gotten us anything. And just the other day, I was talking to some folks, and I said, okay, you want to go out and you want to try to find this scant evidence. Well, obviously they know how to avoid us. They know how to avoid alerting us to their presence. Okay, they probably wouldn't have survived these thousands of years without that ability. Why aren't we out there surveying cave systems? Why aren't we out there surveying underground aquifers where there's water sources that we don't know about? Why aren't we surveying, botanical food sources in certain areas? Why aren't we doing things like that? Because when you start to look at the things that these beings need, you're going to have a very good idea of where they are and where they're moving. And nobody's doing that. We're just not doing it. And like I say, we need to ask better questions of ourselves and do better research and everything like that. I've really started to focus on data mining. Like I say, looking for behavioral evidence in witness encounters and things like that. I've interviewed over 800 people in my time, and I continue to talk to people all the time. I want to know more and more about the witness experience. I started to take a very, very close look at witnesses, and as I said before in the study that I did, I only accepted a third of the people that I interviewed for that particular study, and there are reasons behind it. And we really need to start being able to talk to witnesses differently, interview witnesses differently. vetting witnesses differently. And because I know researchers that will just walk in, take somebody's story and say thanks and walk out, and there's nothing else that they do. Maybe they'll search around the area where the sighting was, but the sightings are usually 15 years old because people don't want to talk about these things. So we've got to do differently. There's evidence in every story, and especially behavioral evidence that's out there. And if people look into this and they start to recognize what's out there, then we can get a better profile of what's going on. Now, another thing that we need to do is share information, because most of these groups don't share anything. And that's not good science at all. It really isn't. Peer review is something that is absolutely necessary to any scientific process. And the more of that we have, the better off we are. And that's why I've started collaborating with, folks like Dave Zagan and some other folks, that are out there. Dan Nadrello out of Wisconsin. He's a former wildlife biologist who's now a wildlife photographer in retirement, but he's another pure science guy. There's a lot of folks out there like that, and those are the only folks that I really like to, chew the fat with when it comes to the research these days, because they're the ones that are there that are bringing data. The key is bringing data. You've got to produce some sort of data, some sort of thing that can go out there, and it may connect with what somebody else is doing, and that's how science works. That interconnection of multidisciplinary things is the only thing that's going to get us going there. And mainstream science isn't looking, so it's up to us.
Right, but everyone wants to hold on to their stuff and hold it close because they want to be the first one to say that they have that right.
Yep.
And that's the UAP field. That's Bigfoot. That's paranormal. Everyone's doing the same thing. No one wants to share anything. And I think that's where we fall in. Like, I'm down to share anything. There should be some central data websites where you can just put in all your stuff and correspond and search up, we're going to this place and what can we expect and what can we do, and here's what we found when we were there, and now let's share all this.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong, it's absolutely necessary that field work needs to be done, but if everybody's still doing the same field work that has been largely fruitless for 60 years,
right?
What are we doing?
Yeah.
Are we about traipsing around the woods, or are we about solving the mystery?
Yeah. Well, Rich, that hour has come by pretty quick. Thanks for all the information, and gosh, yeah, it definitely. Like I said, I'm not the Bigfoot guy, but I do like having the conversations about it and maybe learning a little bit more about it. So thanks for coming on the show.
That's my pleasure. And you never know how something from a different field is going to relate to what you do. I've had plenty of people from different fields, of the paranormal to talk to, and wow, I just go like, wow, that's amazing. Here's what I have in my discipline, and here's what we do. And it's the interactions and the sharing of information is amazing.
Yeah, it is. Well, thanks for coming on. I'm going to put you in the green room, close out the show, and then I'll be in chat with you.
That's great. Thanks for having me. Take care.
Thanks. I've said it before. I said it this time even. I'm not the Bigfoot guy, but I think there's something out there. I don't know what it is. Maybe a lot of people don't know what they think or what it is. And maybe more people need to start thinking about that and maybe going out and seeing what they can find. Or like Rich was saying, see where the food source is, where the water source is. And then it's share the data. We just need to share everything that we get, no matter what field it's in. We're all trying to do the same thing. And if each one of us do it separately, then we're just starting all over again. If we shared it, then we would have a new beginning to be able to start off of and continue some research instead of starting over. Well, thank you all for coming tonight or watching the show, and we'll see you next week.
Unraveling the Darkness would like to thank Horn Paranormal Research for sponsoring our show. If you're craving more paranormal content, don't forget to check out our YouTube and Facebook channels at Way Out West Paranormal and Unraveling the Darkness. You can catch all of our episodes of Unraveling the Darkness on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, and YouTube. Be sure to like and subscribe as it helps others find the show and join in on the paranormal fun. Thank you so much for tuning in. Until next time, keep your lights on, stay safe, and remember, the truth is out there, and it might just be closer than you think.